Okay, last week we began looking at turning points in Christian history, and most of you came back, so that's good news for me. I was hoping this wouldn't scare you away. But I assumed before I began this series that many, if not most of you, have never really studied or thought through how the faith of the early Christians that we read about in the New Testament was transferred over the years to us today. Perhaps you've heard a few things or read a few bits, but never have really studied it. I'm hoping to rectify that by teaching through what I consider to be the key turning points in the first 1,000 years. The first of which was the events in and around 70 AD, which we looked at last week. That was the moment when the Christian faith was stripped of its Jewish framework by the events involved in the destruction of Jerusalem in the Jewish-Roman War. Until that moment, 70 AD, the covenant that the Jews had been under for 1,200 years, since the time of Moses, 1,200 years. It had been intact. There was a temple for worship for most of those years. There was a Levitical priesthood that ran the temple, a system of animal sacrifice that enabled them to find atonement for sin. They had feast days and worship days. It was all. And meanwhile, the followers of Jesus at that same time, in the first century at least, from the time of his death, resurrection, and ascension around 30 AD until 70 AD, they had operated under a new covenant, right? That Jesus had established through his blood, where the Spirit of God had rendered the physical temple in Jerusalem unnecessary, because now every believer who had the Spirit of God in them was a temple. And the Spirit of God had ordained all followers of Jesus as priests. You no longer needed the Levitical priest line because now all Christians were priests infused with God's Spirit. And the Spirit of God had confirmed within them that their sins were forgiven once and for all through the sacrifice of Jesus. So Jesus had inaugurated this new way of thinking and worshiping, but during that first generation, from 30 to 70 AD, the old covenant of Moses and the new covenant of Jesus, they were operating side by side. Even though the old covenant, according to, we looked at this last week, Hebrews 11, had been rendered obsolete, still they were operating side by side. Well, in 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem meant that the Christian faith would move forward unencumbered by Judaism or the Old Covenant. And that, I believe, is the first major turning point in our faith history, because everything changed after that. The Jews went ahead and figured out how to operate in Judaism without all those things they had had before. They figured out a different way to move forward. But the Christian community, Jews and Gentiles alike, were never again encumbered by it. They never had to worry about that again. No one talked about circumcision ever again in the church. No one talked about, well, should we drain the blood from the animal before we cook it, or should we, not eat pork? No one worried about that in the church ever since 70 AD, because those attributes of the Mosaic covenant had been stripped away. Okay? The second turning point is less clear in terms of a date, but I'm going to go ahead and assign it 110 AD. So about 40 years after 70, right? 70 to 110, 40 years, which is a generation in Scripture. One generation is 40 years. So one generation later, and nothing in particular happened at that exact moment, except archaeologists have found letters written in 110 AD by the leader of the church in Antioch, an important church in the early days, a leader named Ignatius. His letters to believers in that area reveals some of the changes that had occurred in the generation after 70 AD, right? And that signifies another important turning point for us in our study because it impacts us today. But first, it's important to recognize the uniqueness of that time period, that first generation after Jerusalem fell. Because one ramification of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD was that the Christian faith no longer had a homeland. Right? It no longer had a center, a place you could say, yep, that's our home base. Because the home base for the Jesus movement, it had been Jerusalem and Judea, right? Everything that was important that happened in the Gospels happened in that area. Well, in fact, everything that had happened from Abraham to Jesus that was important had happened in that geographic area. But once the events of 70 AD occurred, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. It was gone. The original congregation of believers in Jerusalem, they had escaped, right? They escaped north to Pella. The apostles had all fled there 100 miles north, and they began from that point then traveling all over the Roman Empire, just like the apostle Paul had already been doing. We read in Acts and in Paul's letters about the importance of Jerusalem, right? If you have read through the New Testament any time recently, Jerusalem is the homeland of the faith. Whenever a major decision needed to be made, they went to Jerusalem to figure it out. That's where the apostles mainly were. So they'd have a council in Jerusalem because that was the home church. Paul would travel to Jerusalem to argue with Peter and James and John and debate with them over what to do. Paul would raise money with all these Gentile churches and send it back to the church in Jerusalem, especially when there was a famine at one point and the believers there were having real troubles financially. So Paul raised all this money from the Gentile churches and he sent it all back to Jerusalem. We read in Acts and Paul's letters the importance of that area. But after 70 AD, it was gone. That anchor to Jewish history was no longer a factor. And then add to that the fact that all of the original disciples, Jesus' original 12, who served as leaders of the Jesus movement in the first generation, well, they would have all passed away or been killed by 70 AD. Peter, James, John, Philip, Matthew, Bartholomew, Thomas, most of them had been young men when Jesus had called them. Right? Around the year 27 or so, Jesus would have called his disciples. They would have all been about 20 years old at that time. Right? Well, I mean, no one knows their exact age, but they were pretty clearly, based on the language used, they were younger than Jesus. So by the time Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, that would have been, they would have been 60 years old at least, which doesn't seem that old to me today. But at that time, life expectancy in the Roman Empire for men was around 50 years old. 50. So it's pretty easy to say that by 70 AD, most all of the original disciples would have been gone. Right? So in that next generation, 70 to 110 AD, the second generation, the early congregations no longer had a home base, Jerusalem, and they no longer had any apostles living to guide them. Okay, that's why that generation is very unique. And the New Testament had not yet been assembled as we know it today. We'll talk about that another week, but the letters that the apostles had written, they were being passed around and circulated among the churches, but and various narratives of Jesus' life had been written and shared, but there was no center of their faith yet. Who had the authority to make decisions for all Christians everywhere? No one. The apostles were gone. Jerusalem was gone. They didn't have a New Testament yet that was in front of them. So how did they make decisions in all of those local churches all over the empire? To whom could one group of Christians appeal to if they had a conflict with another group of Christians? To whom would they appeal to if they had a theological issue that no one could figure out? There was no authority figures yet in those early years. 2 cities in that time period served as front runners for the honor of being the most important cities for Christians: Antioch and Edessa. Those 2 cities. They were located in the Roman province of Syria, about 300 miles north of Jerusalem. And those two cities, they had very vibrant Christian communities in them early on, the first couple generations after Jesus. You might remember Antioch was the place that we're told where they first were called Christians. We're told that in Acts chapter 11. Well, Antioch became the new home base along with Edessa, which was a few miles away. Those two cities were at the crossroads of the Roman Empire at the time. The Roman Empire stretched, all the way from Italy and Greece in the west, all the way to Egypt in the south, and then all the way to Persia and the Silk Road, all the way to the Mesopotamian east. And both of those cities were filled with diverse ethnic groups and diverse religious ideas because they were commercial centers. They were trade centers where everyone from the empire passed through there to trade goods and services. And that meant that in those cities, there was a good deal of freedom for the Christian faith to grow and to flourish. The big difference between the two cities actually was that Antioch was primarily a Greek-speaking city, while Edessa was a Syriac-speaking city. Right? Both facilitated major commerce for the empire, but they used different trade languages to do that. And so that allowed Antioch to become the leading edge of trade for all Greek-speaking parts of the empire. And Edessa became the leading edge for all the trade for the East, the Syriac-speaking empire. Right? Now, what matters about that is that language, it impacts a person's perception of reality. I don't know if you've ever studied language, but the language we all speak help us form our worldview. How we speak about our world, how we even think about our world. Language acts as the primary filter through which our brains categorize and organize sensory information. Language impacts how we prioritize one set of facts or figures over another set, and one set of experiences over another set. Language is vital to how time is perceived, and how one thinks about and explains abstract concepts. I mean, like faith or the mystery of the Trinity. What language you think in impacts how you figure out how to explain those things. What happens in baptism? What do the elements of communion represent? Language impacts how a person thinks. So as you might expect, when Christian groups began growing in number and size in those two cities, one in Antioch, one in Edessa, the language difference between them pretty quickly led to differences in their conception of the Christian faith and in their practice of the Christian faith. Their worship services began being very different from each other because their languages were different. How they spoke of Jesus was very different. How their times of worship were constructed. How the teaching time was put together. They began growing apart, very different between them. What the teaching time focused on. How their priorities as an organization were determined. How they organized themselves. Believe it or not, language differences created differences in the theology and worship practice between congregations in the east, coming out of Edessa, and out of the west, coming out of Antioch. Lots of differences between those. After 70 AD, when the Jewish center of the faith was removed from the map, these two cities to the north of Palestine became the launching pad for ministries. The truth is, most of us had never heard about the Jesus movement that flourished out of Edessa in the Syriac language, right? Unless you grew up Eastern Orthodox, you have never even heard of Edessa or what might have occurred over in the Persian part of the Roman Empire. Because that moved out of Edessa and moved all the way down the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, all the way to India. And all the way from Edessa in the northern Silk Road route, all the way to China. We don't hear about any of that, right? Because our tradition comes out of Antioch, out of the West, out of the Greek-speaking West. And our New Testament was all originally in what language? Greek. But the New Testament was equally written in Syriac, just in a different language, right? So a lot of that, it has impacted the way that we think of Christian history. We really think of Christian history as a Western civilization entity because our tradition came out of Antioch. But actually, the Apostle Thomas led the way from Edessa all the way to India. And we'll discuss that more another week. History reveals that our particular tradition has been impacted directly from the church in Antioch, not the one in Edessa, and that brings us to 110 AD, when the writings of the leader of the church in Antioch, Ignatius, began writing. 7 letters of Ignatius have been found and declared historically authentic by scholars. And those 7 letters give us insight as to how the early church coming out of Antioch was organizing itself. We know nothing of Ignatius's early life or upbringing. He didn't write about himself at all. We have no idea what he looked like, although, this is one artist's conception. I'm not sure why the early church fathers are all pictured as bald, but I think that's supposed to mean that they're wise. I think that's what that means. So all of you who are, take that as a compliment. But we really know nothing of what he looked like. We don't know how he became a Christian, although in one letter he says that he was the last of all to be a believer and that he had come to the faith unexpectedly. So it makes you feel like, well, maybe then he came kind of later in life. He kind of like the Apostle Paul. He came to his faith unexpectedly. We're not sure what. He never says anything more about it. But what we do know for sure is that he was arrested and condemned to death in 110 AD, right, for refusing to participate in the offerings and sacrifices of the Roman religion. Right? That's actually documented by Roman historians. Under the Emperor Trajan, it became required for all citizens of the Roman Empire to offer incense to Roman deities, including the emperors, in order to prove that you were loyal to the Roman Empire. That became the test, if you were a loyal citizen or not. Which, in our case, maybe doing the Pledge of Allegiance, right? That is kind of like a sign of loyalty to our country, or putting a flag out, right? I mean, those are kinds of things that we do. But at that time, you were to light incense at the Roman temple to the different emperors to show that you were loyal. Okay. Ignatius must have said, no, I won't do that. And in fact, that was actually a big deal for Christians in those days, deciding whether or not they would say yes to that or no. Because what they had been taught was Jesus was Lord, Caesar was not. They also came to realize, and if I say Jesus is Lord and I will not offer incense, then their life could be forfeit, right? According to a Roman a governor of a city in that area, his name was Pliny. He wrote that the official policy at that time was for Christians was that they were only to be prosecuted for not doing the loyalty pledge if someone formally stepped forward and accused them of that. So it's not like they were watching out. They had a checklist for all the names in the city. They weren't doing that yet. But at that time, someone would have to turn you in. So Ignatius must have been turned in by someone who went through that whole process, and eventually he was brought to trial, and he publicly confessed that Jesus was his only Lord. He would never change his mind about that. So at that point, he was shipped to Rome to be put to death in the Colosseum. And it was on that journey, that voyage, when he wrote a bunch of letters to the believers back in Antioch, giving them instructions, discussing various issues and how to proceed without him, the head leader. And it's from those letters that we learn how the church in this time period was organized. Right? Now, when I say organized, I mean the way that churches are structured internally, right? How they operated, who was responsible for what, how they governed themselves, how they related to other churches around them. This image, this next image, go ahead, the next one. This is how we typically think of church organized. This is a very modern org chart, right? Clear lines of authority, kind of a top to bottom kind of thing. But in those early years, it was not that way. There was actually no clear org chart. There's nothing in the New Testament that tells us that. There were no denominations that kind of arranged things a certain way. There was no Catholic and Protestant traditions that helped guide them. They were just local groups of people without facilities who had made the choice to follow Jesus, and they were going to reject all other religious options. Every Christian group in those days was a sister to the next group. They all felt like they were on the same team, in the same family. You know, whether they were in the same city or in a different geographic region, they all felt connected. But even though there was quite a bit of cohesiveness in those early days, all human groups need some kind of governing structure to ensure that over time people don't drift away or drift apart, or to make sure that everyone is doing what they ought to be doing, making sure no one is neglected, making sure no one is lazy and not carrying their weight. A system has to be created to resolve conflict whenever that might arise. Humans have always needed this kind of organization. Even in our families, we have organization. How do things work? Who has the final say? Because as you know, you put 4 people in a room, there's 4 opinions, right? And even if they're young, they all have their own opinion about how things should go. So churches are no different. We see in the book of Acts, fairly early on in Christian history, Acts chapter 6 documents how an issue arose within the congregation in Jerusalem as certain people were feeling neglected. And the apostles, they felt convicted over that. And they wanted to make sure that everyone was being treated well, but they had their hands full of preaching and leading all kinds of people to the faith and praying for everybody. They didn't have any more time or capacity to address those concerns. Not that I relate at all. Those of you who have read that account, you know that they decided to establish a new group of leaders who would focus on making sure no one in the congregation felt neglected, while the apostles, they remained focused on preaching and prayer. That new group came to be referred to as the deacons, right? The ones who serve. That's what that word means, the ones who serve. That was the first real organizational decision of the early church. They had 2 groups of leaders, one focused on preaching and prayer and one focused on the needs of the congregation. And then in the next few decades, as there were more congregations than apostles, the Apostle Paul suggested a different kind of structure. He began telling churches in his letters to divide the work of ministry around the gifts of the Holy Spirit. You can read how Paul describes this system of organization in 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, and Romans 12, and Galatians 1. He says, hey, if one person has the gift of teaching, well, they ought to be the one teaching. And if another person has the gift of administration, well, then that person should help administrate and organize things. That's their gift. And if another person has the gift of mercy, well, that's the person who should be visiting the sick. And if a person has the gift of giving, well, they should take on the greater burden of financing this whole thing. Paul spoke of this structure as a very flat organizational structure, without any kind of hierarchy really at all. No one was the top leader in that structure, with everyone else below them. Everyone had a role, he said, just like your own body. Every body part has a function. Some are more, you feel like they're more important than others, but honestly, you can't miss your toe without feeling it, right? This is what Paul says. Everyone has a place, everyone matters, no one is better or worse than anybody else. And their worship service at that time reflected that organizational structure. Paul tells them in 1 Corinthians 14, when you come together, every person should have a song to share, or a lesson, or a revelation, or a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all these things be done for the strengthening of the church. This was Paul's first attempt at figuring out church governance and organization. His first thought was, well, let's just make everyone equal and everyone take responsibility for what we do together and everyone bring something to share on a Sunday morning. You know how long that worship service would be if they had 150 people? Pretty quickly, as the churches began to grow, guess what? They realized, oh my gosh, I don't think that works anymore. Also, all the gifts aren't always clear. Who has what gift? What if you have a couple gifts? Does that mean you do double work? Paul didn't explain that in his letters. And so pretty quickly, though, in those decades, they began realizing that system is, theoretically, it would work if you have a small group. If your church is 25, oh, well, everyone can pitch in, right? And it makes sense. But as it begins growing, doubling, tripling, quadrupling, and then more, you begin to realize, actually, that really is difficult. So in his later years, his letters to Titus and Timothy, written about 10 years after the letters to Corinth and Ephesus and that kind of thing, Paul indicates his thinking had shifted to a little bit more hierarchical structure within each church. And he said there are groups of leaders that have certain responsibilities, including deacons, diakonoi, who cared for the people of the congregation. But now he has this group of leaders called elders, presbyteroi, who led the congregation spiritually. And then there was also the bishops or the episcopoi, who were considered the overseers of the congregation, the ones on the very top. Their role was to shepherd the flock. Now, actually, in Paul's letters, there's no indication, even though the bishops were considered overseers, he doesn't make any indication that they were over the elders or they were over the deacons. There's no hierarchy still, except that those three groups of leaders were over the congregation. That's the only thing you find in Titus and in Timothy. It was flat, right? A flat organizational structure. But in the letters of Ignatius in 110 AD, Ignatius, one full generation later, we find him writing about a much different kind of structure, a more hierarchical structure where the bishop of each church was now at the top, holding primary authority for everything that went on in his congregation. And the elders and the deacons functioned beneath the bishop in their roles, and the congregation served with their gifts beneath them. Actually, Ignatius doesn't mention the gifts of the Spirit at all in his letters, right? Only the directive for them to follow their leader. In one of his letters, he wrote as he was traveling to Rome, Ignatius encouraged the congregants, follow the bishop as Jesus Christ followed the Father. In other words, trust your bishop and submit to his will, because isn't that what Jesus did to his Father? Do what the bishop tells you. Follow his example in the faith. He's your spiritual leader. That's what Ignatius says 40 years later. And then Ignatius goes on to write, whenever the bishop appears, there let all the people be. In other words, if you have a bishop, you have a church. Because wherever your bishop is, there's your church right there. That's the focal point of everything. A bishop being present is what gathers the people. And then Ignatius continues. He says, it is not permitted either to baptize or hold a love feast apart from the bishop. Now, a love feast was what they called communion in those days. So you can't do those things unless the bishop is present, but whatever he may approve, that is well-pleasing to God, that everything which you do may be found sound and valid. What this tells us is that by 110 AD, all the apostles were gone, and now that authority rested in the hands of local bishops. Right? Each local congregation of Christians were gathered under the authority of a bishop. Now, for most of us who grew up in the Protestant tradition, perhaps we've never been in a church where the leader was called a bishop. Right? I didn't grow up in a church that ever used that word bishop. For me, that was a piece on the chessboard. Right? That wasn't a title. For many others, though, they grew up in an Episcopal kind of system where that word was used, right? Today, we use the word pastor. right, for the most part. But what's interesting is when you read Paul's explanation in Acts chapter 20, he states that the responsibility of the bishop was to shepherd or pastor the people. In Paul's writing, those two, one is the title, one's the role. The bishop shepherds, the bishop pastors, right? So whichever elder was the congregation's bishop at that time, they were the congregation's pastor, which should sound more familiar to all of us because that's how we're organized today, right? As part of the elders, I've been assigned the responsibility as overseer, as the pastor of this congregation. That's how we operate today, right? Well, by 110 AD, when Ignatius wrote those letters, that leadership role in the local church had assumed even greater prominence than it had 40 years earlier. Each bishop was the clear, true leader of each congregation, and the people were to pattern their Christian walk after your leaders. The leader is responsible for your spiritual life before God. Now, what is not present at that time in Ignatius' letters was any governing structure beyond the local church. Notice how this org chart is only valid for the local church. See that at the very top? I highlighted it there. This is the local church organization. There is no indication historically that there was a bishop over all the other bishops in the city. No indication of that. Or over all the churches in that geographic region. Ignatius wasn't writing as the head bishop of all the bishops. He was writing as the bishop of his church to his church when he got arrested. Which means there was no bishop over all the churches in Greece or all the churches in Asia Minor or all the churches in Italy, headquartered in Rome. Ignatius spoke only of following your local church's bishop, your pastor. He never mentions any other form of leadership structure in the Christian church in 110 AD. A century later, that had changed. Right? By the time of Irenaeus, in about 185 AD, Irenaeus wrote that the bishop of the church in Rome was the top dog. He was the head over all the bishops and head of the whole Jesus movement. That happened a lot closer to 200 AD than 100 AD. And Irenaeus in 185 was the one who crafted this argument that from the time of Jesus, his authority had been passed on to Peter, and Peter from Linus to Anacletus to Clement, and so on and so forth, an unbroken line of apostolic succession from Rome. That idea was created in 185 AD. That it was not part of early church history before that. No writing from those early days supports that idea. Instead, it appears that Irenaeus was battling against a particular heresy in the late 2nd century. We'll talk about that another week. And the strategy that he chose to defeat that heresy at the time was the idea of an unbroken chain of apostolic succession from the time of Jesus to establish the authority of the Bishop of Rome. And he might have even believed that to be true, but there's simply no evidence for it beyond his writing. It is true that by 185 AD, there was a head bishop in Rome. Later, he was called the Pope, about 600 years later. And many other writings confirm that governing structure came to pass in the church, but it wasn't present in 110 AD, not one generation afterwards. It was too soon for that kind of broad organizational structure across the empire. Rome wasn't even the center of the faith at that time. The center of the faith was Antioch and Edessa. Furthermore, Ignatius in 110 never mentions anything like that as a system. Right? He only spoke of the local church governing structure. He never mentioned that he had any expectation to be supported or helped by the bishop in Rome. He doesn't even mention that. Even though he was sentenced to die in the Colosseum, you'd think, well, maybe he would. And you remember when we looked at last week at the end of Acts, Paul is present in Rome in his own house for 2 years. He doesn't ever mention Peter coming to visit or expecting Peter to visit him. Actually, there's no historical evidence whatsoever about that. Only rumor and tradition that started about 200 AD, right? Now, what I've explained to you today is it's really the first of three conceptual threads that kept the Christian movement fairly unified in the early days. I think there's three threads that kept the whole thing from unraveling. The first being the emergence of church organization, a system of church organization. And it's constructed around local leaders. We see that first in the book of Acts, and then in Paul's letters, different ones in Paul's letters, a development of some way of organizing all these people who are coming together to gather and worship Jesus' name. That's one thread that kept the Christian movement united and cohesive in the early days. The second thread was the circulation of two collections of Christian documents. The first collection was gospel accounts. By the time of Ignatius, 4 accounts had risen to the top of the heap. There was a lot of them, documenting the events of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those 4 are mentioned that early. And then there was another collection of letters from the apostles, from Paul and Peter and James and that kind of thing, that had been generally accepted by most of the church at that time. We'll talk about that next week. But those 2 collections eventually came to form our New Testament. That was definitely a turning point. But just understand that it was an important thread, collecting their documents that they all agreed was central to their faith. We need these to keep us all on the same page. Those documents became the New Testament. And then the third thread was the development of something called a creed. These were short, concise summaries of what we believe as people, right? And there were several that were developed in those early years. But along with the emergence of church organization and the emergence of an actual canon of New Testament scripture, the writings, these creeds help bind the churches together. It's like, if we agree about these things, these are our essentials, we're all in the same movement. We're sister churches. We can expect to go from this city to the next city, and it'll be basically the same. Okay, that would not be true if you went east, but if you went west, that would be true. Right? The East had their own thing. I hope this has been helpful to you. It's probably more history than you ever wanted to learn on a Sunday morning. But hopefully you just learned something new. Next week, we'll explore the development of the New Testament scriptures. If you have never known how that came together, we'll talk about that next week. And then the week after, I'll talk about the development of the different creeds that came to be developed that help unite the early church. So I hope you'll come back and we'll explore more of these things. All right, let's pray. Jesus, we are speaking today of your church, the one that you said the gates of hell would not prevail against. That you said would start like a mustard seed, really small, perhaps in just 1 or 2 little towns, and would eventually spread to cover the whole earth. And we see the truth of that in our history. Our Christian faith has spread far and wide. We talked this morning about India and the movement that's going on there. Many of us have traveled in other parts of the world, and what do we find? We find Christian churches. Not necessarily facilities, but we find congregations who are worshiping you and who believe that you are the way to salvation. We are grateful to have been part of that movement, to be part of that history. We love the fact that we get to gather on Sundays in your name and encourage one another in the faith. And it's all because, Jesus, you came, you died, rose again, ascended to the right hand of the Father, and from there, you keep us on the right track. Grateful for your Holy Spirit that has come into our lives to make all things new. Hearing us now as we worship and respond in song. Pray this in your name. Amen.